Okay, and welcome back in public. This is our fourth item of business, is consideration of two legislative consent memorandums on the UK Government's Sustainable Aviation Fuel Bill. The first of these was laid on the 25th of July. We're also taking the opportunity to look more broadly at the prospects for sustainable aviation fuel production in Scotland and its potential role in reducing greenhouse gases from aviation, an issue that is bound to arise when we consider the transport chapter of the next climate change plan later this year. I'd like to welcome to the meeting Jim Fairley, the Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity from the Scottish Government, obviously Chris Bryceland, the Team Leader for Critical Energy Infrastructure for the Scottish Government, Kirsty Ryan, Solicitor for the Scottish Government, and Terry Shelvin, the Aviation Statement and Sustainable Aviation Team Leader from Transport Scotland. Minister, I'm going to give you the opportunity to make a short opening statement.
I will be as short as I possibly can, Convener, and thank you very much. I welcome the opportunity to speak with the committee today about this legislative consent memorandum and the supplementary legislative consent memorandum for the UK Government's Sustainable Aviation Fuel Bill, which was introduced in the House of Commons on the 14th of May in 2025. The Scottish Minister strongly welcome efforts to boost the production and the use of sustainable aviation fuel and therefore support the overall policy intention of this bill. Sustainable aviation fuel is one of the most promising ways of reducing aviation emissions, and it is therefore important in supporting the Scottish Government's commitment to achieve net zero by 2045. If SAF were commercially produced at scale in Scotland, it could bring significant economic benefits, including the creation of green jobs and investment in infrastructure. Therefore, the Scottish Government is recommending that the Scottish Parliament gives consent to clauses 2, 4, 5 and 12 to 19 of the bill. The Scottish Government has had extensive engagement with the UK Government, both at official and ministerial level, to resolve concerns around the regulation-making powers in the bill, which may be exercised for a devolved purpose in Scotland. Whilst my earlier meeting with Minister Mike Kane in the summer did not result in agreement, I am encouraged more by the productive discussions with the successor Minister, Keir Mather. As such, I remain hopeful that a solution can be reached, one that respects the devolution settlement and ensures that a formal role for Scottish ministers is set out in the face of the bill. As things stand, the bill does not provide a statutory role, and we continue to press for amendments that would provide appropriate safeguards and accountability, and believe a statutory consult or consent mechanism would offer reassurance and transparency, particularly given the early stage of development of the UK SAF industry. So until agreement is reached and the necessary amendments are secured, Scottish Government is recommended withholding consent for clauses 1, 3, 10, 11, 2 to 5 and the schedule. And Scottish ministers remain committed to constructive engagement and to supporting the measures that could lead to an increased production and use of SAF in Scotland. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I think the Scottish Government are happy to support parts of the bill with the LCM because they believe it will increase production or opportunities for production of SAF in Scotland. What gives you that opinion, and where do you think that will happen?
Well, I think the whole world is looking at how we are going to reduce the impacts of aviation on our climate as we know it. So if there is a global push to allow us to reduce our emissions into the atmosphere while not having a negative impact on our connectivity, then I think that's got to be a global effort that we should all get behind. And Scotland is perfectly placed to be very much part of that. It's not just about SAF, there's also hydrogen, there's zero emissions aircraft that could be developed here in Scotland. So we're in the very early stages of that. I get that we've been talking about it for a long time, but we're in the very early stages of what this revolutionary project is going to look like. And I think that Scotland is in an ideal position to take advantage of it.
I agree with you in principle, but that you are saying that the LCM will help increase SAF production in Scotland. You've said that your ideas of why that should happen. I want to know concrete why you think it's going to produce and where it's going to be produced, where you see that coming from.
Well, as you know, there are a number of ongoing projects. Project Willow is looking at what we can potentially do in Grangemouth. There is currently a project ongoing in Orkney. There is regular conversation with Scottish Government officials and UK Government officials, but a lot of this is reserved So you're absolutely right. There are a lot of things that we can't control in this country, but I see that there are possibilities for us to be able to have ongoing discussions to see how we can maximise the opportunities for people here in Scotland.
But the evidence we heard on SAF in previous sessions was that where it's used the most will probably be the area in which it's produced or in that locality. So that's not necessarily going to be Orkney or Aberdeen, is it? Or do you see that this LCM, which is the point of view agreeing here, will help the production of SAF in both those areas, for example?
Well, I think there is ongoing discussion to be had on all these things. Consumers may want it to be as close to their point of consumption as they could get it. Producers may want it to produce it closer to their production. So how do we have those negotiations and those conversations at a UK-wide level so that Scotland can be part of the beneficiary of what this new technology is going to deliver? And I think that it's only right that the Scottish Government explores every avenue to see how we can take advantage of that.
Okay, sorry, I'm obviously doing this very badly, Minister. I'll go back to my questioning. I'm asking how this LCM is going to do that. Just by agreeing something is not telling me how it's going to make it happen, which is why you're saying that you're agreeing to the LCM.
The LCM is the UK Government's position that they have put forward that they are going to make sure there's development in SAF and other emission-reducing aviation projects across the UK. So by agreeing in principle to this LCM, it allows us to be part of that conversation. Where I have concerns, where the Government has concerns, is where that starts to touch on devolution and takes out the ability of this Parliament and this committee to be able to scrutinise what's coming next. And that's why we have got revisions on some parts of the LCM.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm getting any further on this. I'll move to the Deputy Convener, Michael Matheson. Michael.
Good morning. Can I turn to the issue around the Scottish Government's position on this LCM at the present moment, and that is to give consent, but withhold consent in, I think it was 4 or 5 clauses within the bill as it stands, including clause 1 and 3, which relate to the revenue certainty contracts and how they are allocated to SAF producers. Can you maybe just explain to us, in each of those clauses that you're recommending that consent is withheld, what are the particular points on touching on devolution that you feel need to be addressed in order to get agreement with the UK Government?
Well, the UK Government feels that these are areas that, while they accept that they touch on devolution, but at the same time they say, but we don't really need to bother you with it. Particularly in clause 1, we're talking about a certainty that will be set over a 10-year period. Well, we've no idea what's going to happen between now and then. The vast majority of us won't be sitting in this Parliament in 10 years' time. So I think it's only right that when that is a devolved area, that this Parliament has the right to be able to say, OK, what does this actually mean? We've no idea what changes are going to be. We've no idea what the outcomes of the various discussions that are going within the UK and globally as to how this is going to develop. And if the UK Government's position is that, well, it's a technical thing, we don't really need to worry about it, if it's that small, why would we not just give consent? The only way that a Scottish Minister or a Scottish Parliament would refuse to give consent would be as if there was a concern. So therefore, when the UK Government are saying to us, these are minor technical issues, you don't need to worry about it. If they're minor technical issues, then we will agree. Now, I think I remember the convener, you raised the issue about us not getting time to scrutinise properly things, and you raised that in the Chamber last week, I believe. So if we've got these issues where we're not even getting them given to us in time, how do we know what the detail is going to be when we're looking at something that it could be 10 years down the line? So I think it's really important that we protect the right of this Parliament to be able to have a say in things that are going to be touching on our devolution.
Okay, would it therefore be fair to characterise the position the Scottish Government has on this LCM as an interim position, and that is that we are supportive of the intention behind this bill and to give consent to this LCM. However, if the outstanding areas that you have concerns about are not sufficiently addressed by the UK Government. The potential final position of the Scottish Government is to withhold consent. Am I understanding that correctly?
What I don't want to happen is that Scotland somehow becomes isolated in this project for us to be able to develop these sustainable aviation fuels. But where there are areas that are touching on devolution, I think there's a negotiated position that we can have. And as I say, I'm having a better relationship with the current minister, who seems to get the fact that these are issues, genuine issues, that we need to get over. So I'm hoping that we can negotiate a position where we will get a satisfactory agreement to the clauses that we have concerns with. And if we get that agreement, then, great, we will move on. If we don't get that agreement, we will come back to the committee as to what our position would be at that point.
Okay, so if you don't get agreement, and I don't know what the time frame looks like to these other clauses, is there the potential for the Scottish Government to recommend that that the LCM, consent to the LCM is withheld?
I am optimistic that we will get a satisfactory conclusion.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that, if that's okay.
I think you've taken a negotiating position there, so in this issue. Can I therefore turn to the issue around SAF? And I think you correctly point out there is significant potential for the manufacturing of SAF in Scotland. I wonder if you can maybe give us a sense of, from the Scottish Government's perspective, where you think the greatest potential is in sustainable aviation fuel. Is it in the first, second or third generation of SAF? And do you think that the potential time frame for the development of these 3 generations of SAF will be different over the course of the next 10 years?
I'm going to bring Terry in for the technical side of that.
Yeah, there are different types of SAF, as you have alluded to. One thing that I think is worth highlighting is that Scottish Enterprise is currently doing an economic impact assessment of SAF potential for Scotland. They hope to have that completed by the end of the year. And I think that once ministers have that information, they'll be far better placed to consider some of the questions that you've talked about. But certainly from having read the committee's previous evidence sessions, there seems to be, if not a consensus, a general view that power to liquid, which I think you would call third generation, has the greatest potential, but equally that appears to be the one that's perhaps furthest out in time. There's already production of first generation or HEFA SAF in various countries across the UK. We obviously have active discussions going on following Project Willow in Grangemouth. Scottish Enterprise are involved in those, and the Scottish Government has also responded to some of the recommendations in Project Willow. They've looked at potential crops that could be used for first generation SAF, Chris. So I don't know if you want Chris to pick up on that particular piece of work that's been commissioned.
Yes, so in answer to your question, all the kind of SAF projects that you see globally at the moment that are at commercial scale are all HEFA based SAF projects. So that means they rely on waste oils, fats and greases. Now, obviously, the supply of waste oils, fats and greases is limited if you're looking at a sector as big as aviation. So you need future type fuels to do that. In terms of their commerciality and how long they take to get to market, there's been a couple of examples. There's the Rodeo refinery in California that looks to use soybeans as a source, a feedstock source to make aviation fuel. Now, it took 4 years to get from, a kind of concept conversion of a refinery to, a commercially producing facility. Similarly, Neste in Singapore, 5 years it took, from concept to actually producing fuels. So if we're looking at that as a pathway for places like Grangemouth, we have to be realistic about the timescales. There's a lot of project development work that is required now, before businesses are able to invest, and a lot of things that business need to see in terms of certainty. So, Project Willow recommended, some key actions for Scottish Government. The prime thing was around feedstocks. So in Scotland, there isn't enough feedstocks, waste oil and, greases and fats to meet the demands of a commercial scale biorefinery. So it recommended...
And that's from a country that apparently fries all its food.
So Project Willow recommended that we look at a cover crop called camelina. So cover crop's a crop that grows off season, so in the sort of autumn and winter months. Now, camelina's been grown successfully in America and Canada, and used for a test flight that Delta had last year, so it's proven. But we don't know yet, if it is suitable to Scottish conditions. So we've asked the Hutton Institute, along with the Scottish Rural College, to do a desk-based review, which they've now completed. The results are on the Safari website from Scottish Government. Saying, can you produce this at the scale required, and what are the implications that government should consider? Based on the results of that desk study, we're now taking forward field trials. So seeds went in the ground in September, again led by Hutton and the Rural College, to answer some of these questions. Can this grow? Do you get the yields? What's the impact that it has on soil conditions and the rotational crops? It's going to take a couple of growing seasons before we get that, but it adds to the evidence base around, can we, get enough, oily material to get a commercial SAF plant up and running. So that's the kind of near term. Going to the future, I think the opportunity is around power to liquid. And when you look at, where do refineries and people that make fuel locate, it's either one of two things. So they either locate, where there's significant demand for the fuel, so i.e. near a big airport like Heathrow, or they locate in a place where they've got feedstock advantages. So if you look at the Rodeo refinery in California, lots of soybeans nearby. If you look at Preem in Sweden, it's access to kind of tree material. So that's where these refineries are locating. Power to liquid, if you think about Scotland and the potential we have in renewables, that's where I think the opportunity may lie. And that's where we hope that the Scottish enterprise work looking at the economics and the economic impact of a SAF industry, will come to bear.
So I think that's very helpful. Thanks very much for that. I must confess, though, I'm a wee bit conflicted on this idea of investing in HEFA, given the mandate which the UK government is setting, which means that by 2030, HEFA should decrease to 71% of our SAF production, and by 2040 it should be 35% of it. So, which says to me the future is going to be power to liquid here. Why would I bother spending hundreds of millions of pounds investing in a SAF refinery facility, which I know in the next couple? And you've mentioned the time frames here. I just wonder whether Scottish enterprise are wasting everybody's time in looking at some of this, to be perfectly frank, because I can't see how, from a business sense, it's going to make any sense whatsoever, given the SAF mandate that the UK government's already put in place. Maybe Scottish enterprise should reflect on that, because it may just be wasting everybody's time on this. Can I, though, turn to the other issue, and that is of the funding that's been made available so far by the UK government on through the UK Advanced Fuel Fund to support SAF project development. From counting up the dots, I think there are 19 dots in the paperwork that we've had as a committee. There's only one of those are in Scotland, and that's in Orkney. Why has there only been one project receive funding from the UK's Advanced Fuel Fund so far compared to the rest of the UK?
I'm going to yourself, Chris. We have talked about this. I'll turn to you, Terry.
Yeah, it's a matter of fact what you said, that there's only that one project up in Orkney. I asked DFT officials earlier this year if there was any feedback they could provide about the third round of AFF funding, had there been any bids from Scotland, but they weren't able to confirm that. Spoke to Scottish Enterprise. Again, they're engaging with companies that weren't successful in securing the latest round of funding from that source to try and find ways forward. It would have theoretically, I think, Chris, have been possible for Petronas Grangemouth to have tried to access that funding, and maybe Chris would come back on that point. But certainly from the conversation I've had with Scottish Enterprise, so this is second hand, they are speaking to prospective SAF investors in Scotland they can't get into the details of the companies for obvious reasons. But there's a bit of feedback that they provided about the AFF. So this is anecdotal rather than hard and fast evidence, Deputy Convener, but some of the points that are being making is that there have been 3 awards of funding so far, and sometimes it's going to the same recipients, that there needs to be some kind of broader strategy policy in place about carbon usage at a UK level, to try and make sure that the Advanced Fuels Fund is allocated as efficiently as possible. But like I say, those are anecdotal, so I don't want to place too much weight on them, but it's something that Scottish Enterprise has actively been talking to investors about, what they can do to try and help, to try and get better access to that funding. But like I say, I think it would have been theoretically possible, at least for Petri Ineos to have tried to access it for its purposes.
Yeah. I think it's down to, you know, the Advanced Fuels Fund. So, you know, HEFA-based SAF projects probably not what UK government are looking for. They're looking at next generation, you know, projects. And, you know, where we are now, you know, with the launch of Project Willow in March this year, it's really stimulated demand from the market. So, you know, Scottish Enterprise have received, I think, over 120 inquiries into them from project developers looking to develop projects at Grangemouth. Off that, about 20 are SAF projects. So, you know, with a fair wind, we'd like to think that, you know, there'll be access to some of that funding depending on the project. And obviously, I can't get into any, you know, details on specific projects due to commercial sensitivities, but there's definitely appetite from the industry.
I wish I could share your optimism on what will come from Project Willow, to be perfectly frank. When you look at the time frame and the capital investment that's needed for some of these projects. And I'm not aware of Scottish Enterprise actually creating any new jobs in Grangemouth as yet. So, so far, and most of the stuff in Project Willow is 5, 6, in some cases 10 years away. So, so I don't really share your optimism with that. I don't know, is there government-to-government engagement around the issue of the Advanced Fuel Fund and whether more could be deployed for Scottish-based projects? Because the evidence that we heard yesterday was very much in the space that, you know, power to liquid is going to be where the real growth area will be in the future. And actually, the best place to do that is where you've got significant access to renewable energy at low cost. And the best place to do that is in Scotland. Is there government-to-government discussions around the deployment of this fund?
There is a lot of government-to-government conversations, more of it at official level certainly, but I've met both the aviation ministers in my time in office, but Terry and his team are in regular contact with UK government officials. Can I say a bit more about that, Terry?
Yeah, in general, we speak to UK government officials about decarbonisation. Like I say, the contact I had previously was to try and understand why there weren't bids coming from Scotland, but they couldn't get into that. And like I say, that's why I went to Scottish Enterprise to get the feedback. So I think, you know, I don't know what the committee intends to do other than report on the LCM if you intend to follow up on this piece of work. But certainly it might be worth expressing general concern about the lack of funding coming to Scotland. But there may, of course, be reasons for that that we're unaware of. Chris has given one reason for Petri Ineos, but yeah, there isn't any SAF production in Scotland currently. So, but certainly we can continue to convey the concern that there is a lack of funding.
Okay, thanks.
Michael, the next questions come from Douglas.
I'm going to continue on the question around Project Willow that the Deputy Convener was putting there. Obviously, there's 2 SAF projects on Project Willow. One, the first generation SAF, the HEFA one, and the other one, the 3rd generation SAF. Now, Deputy Convener has put to you that, you know, is the first generation one, is it still something that we should be pursuing, especially when we look at the mandates coming forward, that, you know, this is going to be almost at a bridge to other fuels in the future. So do you think it's feasible still to have that within Project Willow, Minister?
I hosted a round table with the aviation industry with the Cabinet Secretary earlier this year. And there is huge uncertainty within the sector about what's the right way to go. It depends on which airline you are. It depends on what your objective as an airline is. So I think at the moment we need to have every tool in the box. We need to know that we've got potential there if that's the way it's going to go. It feels a little bit like, when we've been in this position before, are we going to go Betamax or going to go VHS? And we don't know at this stage. Now, I absolutely take on board the Deputy Convener's point. He knows more about this than probably anybody else in this room other than these officials sitting here. But is there scope to continue with it at the moment? That's going to have to be a decision taken by those that are working on those projects, and they will then advise the government as to whether or not we're in the right space.
So how far away do you think we are from producing SAF within Grangemouth? Is it still 5–10 years away, or is it shorter period than that?
You don't need to touch that. He'll do that.
So, I mean, Project Willow, the SAF projects were mid-term projects, so, around 2030 before you could realise a HIFA project. And that's because it's the most technically mature. I think it's worth, noting that we're not restricted to, the 9 buckets that were in Project Willow. If there is opportunities from other technologies, because there's many ways of producing SAF, that generate, an economic, value case for Grangemouth and, help with our, aviation decarbonisation targets. We are open to speaking with developers, and that's the conversations that Scottish Enterprise are having. It isn't solely on these 9 technology options.
And obviously this bill will produce levies from traditional aviation fuel that can be spent on SAF. So will Grangemouth be able to bid in for that money for a HIFA project? Or are they excluded from this bill?
No, my understanding is they're not excluded from it, and they could bid in for it, but I think that's a bit more technical than that, isn't it?
Well, the bill is designed to reduce key risks to investors. I think that was the point the convener was getting at right at the very start. It's a framework bill, really, and the UK government's currently consulting on the detail of the levy. I think it launched the consultation within the last couple of weeks. So there's no analysis accompanying the bill from the UK government in the explanatory notes, for example, about the extent to which or where SAF production in the UK may increase as a direct result of this bill. It's designed, this bill, to create revenue certainty mechanism, to give that confidence to investors. And that should, the whole point is that should thereafter lead to more SAF plants. Exactly what happens at Grangemouth, we don't know. We can have a conversation about that, but there's no guarantees, of course.
But can it be spent on first generation SAF, or is that excluded from what this?
Well, the UK government's explanatory, the bill itself doesn't get into that, but the explanatory note says it's about getting first-of-a-kind plants built commercially. And I've asked what exactly is covered by that, but 2 of the Project Willow projects were SAF, as you know, and the latter one is not first-of-a-kind by any means. But whether that definition would apply to the first one, that's something I've actively asked about.
And we still don't have any clarity on that, though.
Well, we should get a response from the DFT on that soon, but it's not something that the explanatory notes go into great detail about. It just, they make a reference to first-of-a-kind plants. But there aren't really many SAF plants in the UK as it stands anyway.
Going to my next question, obviously we've heard that for third-generation SAF, what we need is green hydrogen and also a functioning carbon capture industry. So is there a risk to the Scottish SAF industry that it relies on these uncertain net zero industries, Minister?
Is there a threat to SAF production as a result of the uncertainties?
What do you think is the biggest risks to successful SAF production in Scotland?
In Scotland? That it doesn't come to Scotland. I think that's the biggest risk. Clearly we wanted a carbon capture project in the North East, as you will be well aware and very supportive of, but it didn't happen. So is that a threat to anything that gets in the road and slows our opportunities up? Then that is a threat to Scotland not being able to capture this opportunity. And it is an opportunity, and it's an opportunity in this time. So I would be very much looking to make sure that we are working with the UK government as much as we can to get as much of this natural cohesion to come to Scotland, because you're absolutely right, we've got all the ability here to do it, so let's do it in Scotland.
So do we need ACORN in place before we can produce SAF?
You need ACON in place for, do we, Terry, technically?
It's a big question. Certainly, if you're looking to make third-generation SAF, you need that supply of carbon. Could you do it without ACORN? Well, that's a highly technical question, but you do need a source of carbon, certainly. Yeah. Like I say, the Scottish Enterprise economic analysis that they're doing should hopefully shed some light on these questions. There was previous work done. There was a SAF working group set up by the Scottish Government last year, and they got into some of these questions at a fairly early stage, but then Project Willow came along. And it was quite interesting. I think one of your witnesses at the last meeting was saying that for power to liquid, it was commonly held it would be very expensive, but I don't think he held that same view, and that's the first person I've heard say that the power to liquid wouldn't be as expensive. But there was a SAF mapping exercise previously carried out on behalf of Scottish Enterprise, which I think in your first session a witness referred to, and that pointed to Scotland's relative strengths in renewable energy, skills, infrastructure, etc., etc. But to answer the detailed question, it's difficult at this stage.
Okay. Make a suggestion, Minister. It may help you and your officials just to reflect on that, maybe come back to the committee when you've had a chance to reflect on it. It would help us with our SAF consideration when it comes to the climate change plan. I think it'd be useful to have some considered thought process.
We will provide you with as much information as we can possibly provide you with, but there's an awful lot of it that we just don't have.
I'm grateful for that. Sorry, Douglas, to interrupt. Thank you. Mark, I think you've got some questions.
Yes, Convener, I was going to ask a question about the Scottish Government's wider approaches to aviation, Minister, and particularly in relation to an air departure tax, what the plans are at the moment in relation to that. And I believe that there was discussion around an exemption for lifeline flights to Highlands and Islands. And I'm just interested about how that then differs to what's being introduced at a UK level with APD, passenger duty.
The lifeline services to the islands is the sticking point from the Scottish Government's point of view. If there was going to be an ADT, then it would have to be in compliance with the legislation that would allow it not to be seen as a subsidy control issue. And until we've got that bottomed out, which we have not got that bottomed out at this stage, you know, our position will be to continue to make sure that our islands stay as connected as they possibly can, because you know as well as I do that island connectivity is absolutely vital. So we're not going to jeopardise that in any way at this moment in time, because we do not have the certainty around the subsidy control issues.
Yeah, I don't think that's ever been in dispute, that importance of the lifeline flights. But do you have a sense of when that will be resolved? Because I feel we've been talking about this issue now for a number of years, and I understand that's largely on UK Westminster Government in order to address those issues with the subsidy control regime. But is there a sense of a time frame for when that might be resolved, so that there is at least certainty as to what options the Scottish Government does have at its disposal?
The first bit I'm going to say, I missed the first part about the lifeline services. You made something.
I was just agreeing with you.
Oh, I see. Right. My apologies.
And underlining your point.
I see. Right. Got you. In terms of the timescales, Terry, you maybe had more conversation with officials down in the UK Government than we have. But at the moment, my understanding is we are no further forward that is still being looked at.
Yes, it's a taxation lead. Air departure tax will be the Scottish replacement for air passenger duty. So tax officials are working on that as we speak. As the Minister said, what other ministers as a whole want for Scotland is an air departure tax that maintains that vital Highlands and Islands connectivity. But of course we're under a new subsidy control regime, so that is being tested by tax officials as we speak. There's a commitment, it's been well said, that the Government will commit to reviewing the air departure tax bands and rates before it's introduced. And there were high-level principles of the air departure tax published in the summer by tax colleagues, one of which was saying that it could potentially be used for environmental reasons. But no, it's actively under discussion. There's not much more we can say at this stage, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you.
Mark, do you have any further questions? Okay. Douglas, I think there was, you may have wanted to ask a question around pricing. But,
yeah, it was really just to try and understand if there's going to be any price increases to fares as a result of this SAF bill.
As a result of this SAF bill?
Yeah.
Well, I would imagine that the commercial operators will decide how they are going to price themselves on their own profit margins. That will be entirely up to them. But there is this whole thing around, you know, at this stage, this is going to be a really expensive product to use. If we get into a position where we've got a single product that becomes used globally, that will in itself, the market will drive the price of that down. I can't tell you what the price is going to do in the short term as airlines start to develop their price ranges given what they've got to put in. But there is a control mechanism, as you know about. You've heard more about it in this committee than anywhere else, as to how they're going to try to help with that. But these will be commercial decisions made by commercial airlines, how they're going to price it.
But I guess they're going to have a levy that they're going to have to, that's going to have to be paid. They're going to have to use more SAF, which is more expensive than aviation fuel. So I guess we should expect that air travel is going to become more expensive because of some of these subsidies and levies that are coming through.
Yeah, but the SAF may only be more expensive at the moment as they develop the technology, and then it becomes more used, then the price of that should come back down again. But we can't not do it. We need to do whatever we can to drive the emissions down from aviation travel. So if there is a period of time, then the airlines will work out what that means to their businesses and how they're going to manage it.
Because I think we heard last week SAF is 3 to 5 times more expensive than aviation fuel.
Sorry, I missed that. Say that again.
SAF is 3 to 5 times more expensive than aviation fuel. That's what we heard from witnesses last week. So I guess that's going to have to be passed on to passengers. So should we expect air travel to be more expensive as we move to SAF when we have a more expensive fuel, and also because we've got levies coming in on top?
Yeah, well, I think, as I said, that will be a decision for airlines to work out how they're going to continue to provide air travel.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Monica, questions from you.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon to the Minister in the panel today. So we know that the Scottish Government will publish the climate change plan imminently. I think they've told us that in writing today. But just to take you back to the previous climate change plan update in 2020, because there was a commitment to decarbonise scheduled flights within Scotland by 2040. Are you able to confirm, Minister, if that's still Scottish Government policy?
Well, the climate change plan will get published very shortly, but Terry, do you want to come in there?
That's still a commitment, yeah, and it's maybe worth going back to something that the Minister alluded to earlier on, if that's okay. He said that there was an event earlier this year, I think it was in June, jointly chaired by the Minister and Ms Hislop, and the point of that was to bring together aviation representatives to say, if there are going to be electric, hydrogen-powered and hybrid aircraft, and we've seen some positive news about that, which we might come back onto, that begs the question, how are airports preparing for that? Because clearly to have hydrogen and electric aircraft, you have to have the infrastructure in place. So that event that the Ministers jointly chaired involved HIAL, Highlands and Islands Airports Limited, that the Ministers own and largely fund, and other airports and other major players. And the whole point was to understand the state of discussions, who was paying for what potentially, what the current state of the market was, etc., etc. So I think that's worth highlighting, because to meet the commitment that you've just mentioned, it will be largely reliant on a number of things. First of all, these aircraft that are mentioned, while they're in development, there aren't any certified for commercial passenger flight anywhere. So that's a large obstacle that has to be overcome. Because ministers fund and effectively own HIAL as well. There might be funding implications as well. They have 11 airports across the country. We don't know yet exactly what infrastructure for hydrogen or electric would be needed at each of the airports. But it was a starting point to bring everybody together. There'll be follow-up to that event. But that was a core part for trying to hit that 2040 commitment and get some of the wheels in motion.
We've already made investments, and I also attended it's called Sustainable Aviation Scotland, and that's the operators themselves. So it kind of goes back to the question that Mr Lumsden asked about pricing. The industry is looking at this and saying, how are we going to make this work? How are we going to make this viable? How are we going to make sure that we are driving down our emissions? So there is a concerted effort across government, industry, as well as passengers, to say, how are we going to do this? And I think it's actually really exciting. It's actually a really positive thing that's happening just now. So, you know, I hope that we're getting into a position where Scotland actually has the ability to really capitalise on all this, because I think there is huge opportunities for Scotland to be right at the centre of it.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification on policy intention. I wonder if maybe you could give a bit more detail around how that policy intention will be achieved. So in terms of decarbonising scheduled flights within Scotland by 2040, does government anticipate that will be done through the use of low carbon technology or low carbon fuel, or will offsetting be used to achieve that target? Maybe just to help us understand what government means by decarbonising scheduled flights.
Yeah. Sorry,
I know you.
Yeah. So these questions are all at, like say, a fairly early stage, because we do not yet have the aircraft available that would be needed to deliver that commitment. You heard from Loganair recently, and they set out some of their ambitions. I think they've got a target date of 2040 as well. One thing that I suggested earlier on, and say a little bit more detail about it, Zero Avia is one of the leaders in trying to develop zero-emission aircraft. And there was recently funding provided by the Scottish National Investment Bank and by Scottish Enterprise, totalling almost £30 million. And there'll be some manufacturing near Glasgow Airport in the short term. So, and in our aviation statement that we published last year, we set out various commitments that ministers would undertake, in part to help meet that 2040 commitment that you've been talking about. So, for example, ministers said in the aviation statement that they would be willing to consider buying low and zero emission aircraft when they become available for the PSO flights that they help to operate. So there is a lot of stuff that needs to come together. To be honest, a lot of it would rely on the private sector. A lot of it relies on certification, which would be done by the CAA, the reserved body. But the discussion that we had at the ministerial event was a very useful starting point. And also, just briefly, Minister, the Minister mentioned Sustainable Aviation in Scotland. That's a new group that's been set up. There's an awful lot of work going on about SAF, about low and zero emission aircraft. And there was an attempt to set up a Scottish body to make sure that Scotland-specific issues were being aired. The Minister was at the launch of that, and we hope to continue engagement with that group to make sure that Scotland's voice is heard by the UK Government, because its strategy, Jet Zero, applies to Scotland.
And we are actively trying to make sure that we've got Scottish Government officials in that Jet Zero task force, so that we are completely up to date with everything that is going on at a UK level.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's all very helpful, and I would imagine that having that clarity or certainty around policy will help with that private sector investment and buy-in that you mentioned. The expert SAF working group's been mentioned a couple of times already today. Minister, can you give us an update on the work of the expert SAF working group that I believe is convened by the Scottish Government? And are you able to tell us what the group has advised the Government in relation to the forthcoming climate change plan?
Well, the SAF working group was put into abeyance as a result of Project Willow. Now the conversation is whether we stand that up again and look at this specifically. So we're still in discussion around that.
Okay, so in terms of the working group then, you know, was that a useful forum? Was there good advice given to government?
Well,
and
Terry
I don't know how
sat-
often it may or...
Terry sat in that group, so...
Yeah, it was chaired by Transport Scotland. The idea basically was that at that point, was last year, at that point the UK SAF mandate was being developed. And as you know, there are different types of SAF that can be produced. So the idea was to bring together experts in Scotland to say that in the SAF mandate there will be biomass, power to liquid, waste, etc. What could be done in a Scottish policy context in these areas? You know, I think it's fair to say officials are fully cognizant of the fact that you've got the SAF mandate, you've got the SAF bill before you, you've got the Advanced Fuels Fund, you've got the SAF clearinghouse. So there's a lot going on at the UK level. So it's trying to clearly identify where Scottish ministers could add value. So in brief, some of the issues we've talked about already. There wasn't a published report of the group because, for the reasons the Minister said, that Project Willow effectively superseded. But some of the general sentiment, if you like, was that, yes, biofuels would certainly be useful, but there are competing demands on that. HEFA, Chris has already spoken to. Power to liquid was seen as one that in the long term would be most beneficial, but it was stressed that there could be very high cost. So what I think the ministers will want to do is wait and see the Scottish Enterprise report, understand what's been happening with Willow, look again at the SAF working group, and then determine whether it needs to be stood up again, basically, to really hone in on where government could add value.
Mm-hmm. So just so that I'm clear, so you mentioned the working group's in abeyance, so have the members of that group effectively been stood down, or are they on standby to come back? And
it's effectively stood down, yes.
Okay.
So the last meeting was last year, and then because things quickly moved on to Project Willow, that was a real-life situation, if you like, where SAF was put forward as a potential option, whereas the SAF working group was more looking at the theoretical options, what could be possible for Scotland, building on the SAF mapping exercise that was earlier. So we'd get stood up again. There's a lot of goodwill, as the Minister said. It's almost universal desire for more SAF.
Okay. Just the last question on that, so just so that I'm clear, because this committee's got a huge interest in the climate change plan, which we know will be coming very soon. So did the expert SAF working group feed into the climate change plan in any way, or was it already put into abeyance before that work had really developed?
I think the work of the plan's coming out soon, so but I think the work of the group is definitely helpful. Yes, it was a number of experts. One of the things that we were keen to do in the Transport Scotland aviation team was to bring in relevant officials from across government, so from hydrogen, from wind power, etc., because it's a real cross-cutting topic. We don't hold that individual expertise on any of those matters, so it's making it clear to hydrogen colleagues the potential of SAF, making it clear to wind, etc., etc. So certainly the work was extremely useful. There were a lot of very specialist groups and organisations on those that took part in those meetings, yes.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Minister, I think the last question falls to me. Have I missed you? I have missed you, Kevin. What a mistake. That's a huge mistake. I apologise profusely.
Folk don't often miss me, Convener.
No,
good morning,
I won't do it again.
Minister and panel. Minister, earlier on you said that I hope that Scotland is in a position to capitalise on these issues. I would go much further than that. I would say that Scotland must capitalise on all of this. And one of the things where I think we could capitalise is if we actually looked at some of the commentary that was made by some of the witnesses last week, where one of the witnesses suggested that there should be an audit in all of the existing infrastructure that we have to see how we can move quickly to develop sustainable aviation fuel. Obviously, the best being that power to liquid scenario. So, can I ask you, Minister, the UK government have failed to do an audit of infrastructure can the Scottish Government do an audit of infrastructure to see where we could move forward on this much more quickly and at less cost?
One of the things that we had a fairly extensive meeting before we came down here to talk about a lot of these issues, and one of the things that came out of that meeting was to ask the committee, where do you think? Because we don't have the exclusive rights to knowledge and information, and more than happy to hear ideas from the committee. And if you think that that is something that is of great value, then yeah, let us have a look at it. And we could do that audit if it was something that was going to be of value.
So I think the committee would be very grateful if you had an audit. I think that some of the possible future investors would be glad if there was an audit. The UK government seems to be slow in this aspect. I think that, you know, where we can use existing infrastructure to make the change, we should be doing so.
Let us take it away and have a look at it.
Thank you, Minister. You've touched upon already, or your officials have touched upon already, the other opportunities to decarbonise air travel, including the use of liquid hydrogen and battery. And Mr Shevlin talked about some of the work that is going on at this moment. Are we doing enough in terms of our exploration of these possible technologies to ensure the future of our lifeline island links in particular?
Are we doing enough? I don't know, but we're certainly doing plenty. Is it going fast enough? I can't give you a direct answer to that right now. Terry may know more than me. But we are actively alive to the fact that we've got to make sure that we've got island connectivity very much at our forefront of our thinking. Loganair are clearly the biggest player in that area. They were at the round table that I hosted in the summer with Ms Hislop. The work that Terry mentioned with Zero Avia is ongoing. So there's an awful lot of work going on. Is it going fast enough? You know, that remains to be seen.
I wonder if Mr Shevlin wants to come in and comment on that.
Just to add, you probably heard this from witnesses anyway, that when hydrogen, electric and hybrid aircraft are certified as being safe for scheduled passenger services, certainly every expert I've ever heard has said that they're most likely to be used on routes that we see in Scotland. That's why it's so exciting. But as I've said earlier, there is an awful lot of discussion going on. The ministerial event that the Minister has referred to, we spoke to, for example, airports and airlines and other groups in Scotland to say, look, where can we best add value? There's UK discussions going on, etc., etc. And they were quite clear that having that Scottish discussion to identify Scotland-specific issues, if possible, would be useful. So the next step, as the Minister said, is to try and convey that to the UK government through the task force.
So I'm going to come back at a point that you made earlier, Mr Shevlin, and you can answer, the Minister can as well. You talked about the Scottish ministers where they can add value. But quite frankly, and some of these issues, and I recognise that they're reserved issues, aviation is a reserved issue, you know, we shouldn't be adding value. We should be in the driving seat and forcing the UK government into certain positions, because quite frankly, they don't have to think to the same degree about those short-haul flights to the islands, which, you know, the islands would not operate without those lifeline links. So can we be assured as a committee that instead of just adding value, that on certain of these issues, the Scottish Government and your officials will be driving this much more swiftly?
Okay, so let me answer so that Terry doesn't answer this one. Terry will speak as a government official talking about adding value. As a government minister, then I will be pushing as hard as I possibly can to make sure that the Scottish interests are very high on the agenda for anything that goes forward from here.
Okay. One of the other things which you said earlier, Minister, and you know, it's something that I've said myself, is around about you know, where do we fall in all of this? Is it SAF? Is it liquid hydrogen? Is it battery for certain short haul? Obviously, it's not going to be SAF. Liquid hydrogen or battery for long haul. But you give the analogy of the old video cassettes, which I've used in the past as well. But the reality, quite simply, was with videos, we actually ended up with one of the worst technologies and a market control over something that wasn't quite so good. Is there a danger here that we can put all of our eggs in one basket, which is never a good thing? And how do you and the Scottish Government make sure that in all of these fronts we're at the vanguard of the development of these technologies?
Well, going back to the point that you just made about island connectivity, the almost £30 million investment that have come from SNIB and Scottish Enterprise to Ziriavia is not about SAF, it's about other technologies. So we're already looking at what those technologies are and what they can do for Scotland. And I reiterate my ambition and your ambition for Scotland to be at the forefront of all of this. We have to accept the fact that we are in reserved areas, but we will do, and I certainly will be pushing as hard as I can to make sure that we get as much out of it as we possibly can.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
I apologise again for kissing you, Kevin. I won't make that mistake again. Douglas, I think you wanted to come back on a supplementary before I ask mine.
Yes, I did. Thank you, Convener. I want to ask about the SAF working group again. I just wanted to know, how many times did it meet and when did it last meet?
It met 3 times. The last date I can dig out for you after the meeting, but I think it was around about last May time.
Because I'm struggling to understand why it was just put on hold. You know, when we know that SAF is so important going forwards, when we know that you know, we have Project Willow that has 2 SAF projects within it, why was that time chosen to then park that group? Because it seems like, you know, when we're looking at supply chains and everything else, we probably need that group more than ever at that point.
It's a question of resources, I think. I'm here from Transport Scotland's aviation team. The question about economic investment in SAF in Scotland is a much bigger question. Officials from across government were involved in the SAF working group. I've mentioned already that Scottish Enterprise are doing this further work. But I think the main thing is a question of resources. So you had this real-life example that's still ongoing of Project Willow, the 2 possible SAF options. And I know I wasn't directly involved in Project Willow, but a lot of resource has been put into that. And I said there was no final report from the SAF working group, but certainly the conversations were summarised for ministers and the main points that came out were shared as appropriate with people working on Project Willow, with Scottish Enterprise. So there has been that connection. But now that people are learning from from Project Willow, now that Scottish Enterprise is nearing the end of its work looking at the economic impact of SAF, that is when, and it's up to ministers, that's when they'll determine is now a good time to stand it back up. What specifically should we be focusing on?
So did most of the people on the expert working group on SAF, were they sort of redeployed or working on Project Willow instead, or was this different people? Or
well, the people on the SAF working group were a mixture of government officials and external stakeholders. So these people are not full-time SAF officials. It would be people from hydrogen, for example, that would talk about the potential for hydrogen for SAF and so on. They're not dedicated SAF officials, as it were. So with Project Willow, again, Chris, you might want to say a bit more about this, but that's where the focus has been on SAF for Scotland, because it's a live, viable option, if you like.
So, but in terms of resources, sorry, I don't want to labour this point too much. In terms of resources gone, so with these, are you talking about Scottish Government resources, or are you talking about external people that were helping and being involved in this expert group?
When I'm talking about resources, I'm talking about Scottish Government officials. So they were involved in the SAF working group because it was starting. I've talked about the first part of the SAF working group, which was essentially, given the UK SAF mandate will be focusing on certain feedstocks, what could Scottish Government policy, for example, on waste or on power to liquid, how could it adjust as a consequence. But the second part of the group's remit, just to be clear, was more about what potential support the Scottish Government could give for SAF. Support not being defined, could be financial or other support. Now, given that it's fairly close to what Project Willow was looking at, there didn't seem to be much point continuing with the SAF working group when you had, like, say, a real-life live question to discuss. Okay. But now that there's more experience of Project Willow, Scottish Enterprise has been speaking to many prospective SAF producers. There's a chance now to learn from that. But that'll be an advice that goes up to ministers. It won't be led by our team. We're the aviation team, and we do other stuff. It's a much bigger picture, cross-cutting question.
Mm-hmm. Minister, do you think that SAF group should be reconvened? So
It'll very much depend on what the report comes back from Scottish Enterprise as things get wound up. But I would be very keen to make sure that we continue to keep the progress going.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Convener.
Okay, looking around the room to make sure I haven't missed anyone else. Appears not. I'm going to come to you, Minister, with my question. What I think I've heard over the last sessions on this, that electricity-powered planes will offer some short-haul flights and be useful for that. As long as when it comes to hydrogen, there's still quite a lot of work to do before that is going to be a viable fuel. People have talked about fleet upgrades and aeroplanes, and we've heard how long-term that's going to take. You know, a minimum of 10 years was, I think I heard what in the last thing. So what we've seen is we've seen better fuel consumption figures being driven down by the way aeroplanes have flown. And we're talking about the introduction of SAF, which will make a difference. And what SAF will do, I think your own emission and the evidence we've heard today will increase the price of travel, but that will be a commercial decision. But surely to achieve the emission targets that the Scottish Government will be looking forward to from the aviation sector, are you not saying that the only thing that we can reliably rely on is for people in Scotland to fly less? Is that your policy, Minister?
No.
So you're happy for people to continue to fly as and when they want and disregard the emissions that come out?
I am happy for people to be connected. I very much believe that we will find the technological answers. There was an example of this when I attended the, I've forgotten the name of it, the airline in Edinburgh. They brought the new route in to Dubai. Remind me, Terry.
Oh, Emirates?
Emirates,
yeah.
Right. My apologies. Emirates.
I'm sure they'll be delighted.
Yeah, they will be delighted, given the fact that I've been to see them twice. Emirates have designed a plane where the wings come in at certain levels. It's a wee bit like a falcon swooping. It pulls the wings and it has less drag. So it sounds like a silly wee thing, but that's just drag that is using up more fuel. The technology and the technologies and the fuels that we're using, they will help us to drive the emissions down because there's a concerted effort across everybody to do so. Do I want to cut down connectivity? Then I would ask my colleagues in the tourist sector, do they want to cut down connectivity? I would think not. So it's not about stopping people from flying, it's about making sure that we use all the technologies and abilities that we have to drive the emissions down, use the technologies to be able to allow us to continue to fly, but bring that emissions down.
So the emissions targets that we will be looking at, or part of it as part of the transport section of the climate change plan, when it's the draft climate change plan, when it's finally laid in Parliament, which I think I heard today was imminent. We're still waiting for that. Will rely on emission reduction to reduce aviation emissions, and we'll continue to be able to use aeroplanes. And the government has no intention of reducing people's ability to be connected and go on holiday by flying.
Well, I am not going to preempt anything that is going to be in the plan, but my understanding is that there is no desire for us to stop people from flying.
I'm sure that will make some people very happy, Minister. Thank you. On that note, I think we've got to the end of this session. Thank you and your officials for for attending. The committee will consider and agree a report on the Scottish Parliament on the 2 LCMs to the UK bill in the near future. If there is to be another supplementary LCM, we'll also reflect on that too. And I'd just say, Minister, that yes, I did criticise, and I stood up clearly and criticised the UK government when it came to previous LCMs, but I also in there made the point that it's beholden to the Scottish Government to let us have the LCMs as soon as reasonably possible, I think were my words. And so, Minister, I just remind you that I said that, and if something comes up that we should know about, the sooner we get it, the better. And so thank you for that.
Selective quoting.
No, I was honest and attacked both in both directions. And we'll now move into private session. Thank you very much, Minister.